first book in high school, like middle of high school. It's about 4 young people that graduated and went on to college. And I didn't quite finish it. I put it aside for several years, went to college, started working, got married, started having kids, and then decided I'm going to pull it back out, like 10 years later and finish it. So I did that. And then I realized it wasn't very good, And so I kind of put it aside and started writing a new one. I was writing women's inspirational fiction at the time. My second one, I also realized, I couldn't sell it. It wasn't exactly where it needed to be. So I put it aside. But, even those 2 books that will never get published, they really just were kind of practice books, helped me to better my writing, helped me to improve my skills a little bit. And so then I went on, my 3rd book that I finished is my first one that I published with, it was for adults, and I would call it inspirational women's fiction.
Mm. And then what made you decide to switch to doing young adult fiction?
So I never envisioned myself writing young adult because I wasn't really even reading young adult at the time. So I started reading young adult and just kind of fell in love with it. And after I started reading it is when I decided that, that was kind of a point of view I wanted to try and tell a story from that perspective. So my 4th book was called The Huaca, and that was my first young adult book.
Mm-hmm. And then after that, then you had, is it Where I Belong, which won the Puerto Belpré honor, which is so exciting. And then this is your 6th book, right? The Weight of Everything that just came out.
Yeah. Yes, correct. That's my 6th book. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, can you tell us a little bit about your new book?
Yeah. So this is The Weight of Everything. And it's a young adult fiction, takes place in San Antonio, where I happen to live now, about a young woman who's in high school. Her mother has passed away, and her father's kind of fallen apart, and he's drowning in his grief. And she kind of has to hold her little family together, help her dad, help take care of her little brother, who's 8, and help him kind of deal with his grief. And all the while she's, trying to deal with her grief. She's lost her mother, but her father's fallen apart. He isn't working. He's dealing with substance abuse issues. So she's having to kind of get the groceries and pay the bills and get through high school and hopefully, try to teenage life somewhere along the line, fall into love for the first time. And in the midst of it, while she's trying to deal with her grief, she is assigned an art project, and she is an artist. And so she starts to think about how she wants to approach this art project, and she begins researching some of her mother's interests. Her mother was a professor of Latin American studies, so she starts to look into a lot of her mom's teachings and some of the history of her mother's heritage. Her mother's grandfather is from Guatemala, and so she starts looking a little bit into some of the history and culture from that country.
And it's interesting. So there's kind of a common thread from your earlier book, Where I Belong, which talked a lot about kind of immigration and so on. And this one, would you say that's still kind of a theme of the book, or is that more kind of back burner? I mean, I know you're talking about so many different issues, and yet it's kind of this journey of discovery, which includes finding out more about her heritage.
Yeah, it's most definitely. And so from a completely different perspective, in my it's just such a large part of what's happening today is this history that occurred, in 1954 in Guatemala. And I think it just adds to the conversation about immigration from a different perspective.
Definitely. I love that because I think that, you know, the debate, the conversation about immigration, it tends to be really watered down and painted in very broad strokes. And so people don't really understand like the complexity of the issues, or especially even just that it's about Guatemala. And I think a lot of people tend to think of people coming from Mexico and like maybe don't really know the history. I mean, I'm sure don't know the history about Guatemala, and so I loved having that element as well, that it's shows like you said, I mean, this book shows a different perspective on immigration as far as like generationally, but also just as far as geographically, like that some of the history is different. And it also kind of ties back into the early issue in your earlier book about activism. And I know you said that that's something you really admire about this age group, that young people today, I think, don't get enough credit for. You know, we still have this stereotype of teenagers as being very self-involved and just taking selfies and, you know, kind of superficial. And yet you've talked about how much you admire a lot of the activists that are they're young people and they're making such a big difference today. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I was just mentioning to my son the other day, he's 17, and I said, I love your generation. And he just kind of rolled his eyes. But I do, you know, you see it really around the world, from, you know, climate change activists, Greta Thunberg, to a lot of young people you see that are doing like walkouts of school, protesting against gun violence, and more recently things like book banning and some of the legislation passed in Florida, anti-LGBT legislation, those kinds of things that kids are really, that involves them and they're really interested in. And you're seeing them do things like taking to social media and walkouts and things like that that are making their voices heard. And that's very admirable, especially given the fact that when I was their age, I was very, very shy, and I was really scared of doing anything out of the ordinary or feeling different, or just everything was embarrassing to me at that age. And so I think of myself at that age and unable to imagine myself doing some of the courageous things that I see kids doing these days.
Yeah, definitely. I feel the same way. And I also, I mean, you're talking about some of the activists that maybe we see on the news, and yet I think the character in this book is kind of a different, another side of that is in that she's taken on so much responsibility for her family, and in a lot of ways has had to grow up and really quickly. And again, not the typical teenager that we have kind of that stereotype about, that she's having to take on so many responsibilities. And it shows how grief can affect a family. And like I said, how kids sometimes have to grow up quickly in order to take care of their family. So it can, these are really heavy topics, but why did you think this was so important to talk about? And what are you hoping that the readers take away from the book?
Well, I think that Sarah is dealing with a lot of, you know, difficult issues for anyone to deal with, much less, you know, a young person to have to deal with. And I think in my books, a lot of the issues that, or problems or challenges that these kids are faced are really caused by adults, caused by the grown-ups in the world. And so that's a lot that's handed down to them, these problems that they have to kind of navigate, big problems that, you know, even we as adults would have a hard time with. But at the end of the day, I just really want to have a hopeful outlook on the book, because yeah, she's going to have that grief with her all her life, but if, you know, if we could just like focus on the hopeful part, that you know, things that they can do to kind of just have maybe a more hopeful outlook on the things that they're dealing with.
Definitely. And can you also talk a little bit more? I mean, we talked a little bit about the immigration, and part of that is about connecting to heritage. And I just found it was really interesting because I think a lot of YA is about, because that age group, it's like you're finding yourself and your identity, and how you relate to your heritage is really a part of that. So why do you think this is such a great topic for talking about in YA books, and why did you choose that as something that you wanted to explore?
Well, I think a lot of kids maybe, you know, don't really, and I don't think I did at that age, really connect to my cultural heritage that much, as far as like the history, the music, a lot of things that I didn't really connect to because I was, focused on other things. And I think that happens a lot with our young people, that they're maybe not really culture, and so he's got background like from England. And so she has a lot there, to try to connect to, and it's kind of a difficult thing to do. But I think that trying to figure out, like how the past can help you in your present. And I know for me, one of the things that I kind of connected from was, as a young person, not really being too interested in things that my mom had to share necessarily about, our background, our country, and things like that. Our family history just wasn't very interesting to me at the time. And so now as a mom, I'm also thinking about, trying to pass those things on to my kids and wondering, are they interested in it?
Right.
And so from both perspectives, trying to figure out the best way to just connect to those things and figure out how, our past, can define our present and future.
Well, since you have that kind of dual perspective, I'd love to know, what advice do you have for parents or educators for finding that balance of like wanting kids to know about their history and connect with it, but not pushing it on them too much if they're not really, it is kind of a delicate balance. And I'm sure it depends on the kid, but what have you found in your experience?
Yeah, I think to not inundate them with too much information, kind of like sprinkle it a little bit just so they know enough. And then I think eventually they come around and then they figure out, that maybe they have more questions about it. So you just kind of like drop a little bit. Like I've had some conversations with my 17-year-old, and at first, I'm not really even sure he's interested, but then maybe like 4 weeks later, he'll say something to me. Oh yeah, like we've talked before about President Eisenhower, because during Eisenhower's administration is when this event occurred in Guatemala, which is the CIA overthrew their president. And so sometimes I talk about Eisenhower, and so that's kind of like just something like in the back of his mind that later on he'll bring, oh, Eisenhower, that's the president that you're mad at or you don't like or something like that. So just like small little information, and maybe that spark interest or curiosity or more questions down the road. But just inundating them too much, I think, will turn them off, maybe.
Yeah, that sounds like a good balance. Like they know they have enough understanding that they know they can come back to you and find out more later. Definitely. And why do you think that is so? We've talked about how sometimes they're interested, sometimes they're not. They're maybe starting to explore heritage, starting to find out about these issues and finding their voice. At the same time, we have all these book bannings where it seems like people are kind of underestimating what young people can take. Like they're trying to kind of protect them, I guess, or isolate them from these big issues. And why do you think it's important to talk to them about these difficult issues like race, culture, identity? Do you think that people are just underestimating what a young person can kind of handle or what they want to be learning about?
Yeah, I think so. It amazes me that people are so worried about kids being, hurt or something about books where, things that could really hurt them, like guns, but those are the things they don't want to talk about. Those are the things that kids are really afraid of, more issues like that. But as far as, are they or some happen in this country or some the past sins, I guess you would say, of this country, those are important issues, and I think kids can handle them. I'm a fourth grade teacher, and we talk about some of those things in class, and kids are very smart. They can understand things and not feel like, I think part of the problem is maybe like some legislators are worried that kids are like they're responsible, but I think kids have a good understanding that they know that these things happen, it wasn't because of anything that they did, and they don't have anything to feel guilty about. But it is important to understand that they happened, and it's important to realize that not knowing about them is possibly going to lead to those things happening again, but having a good understanding of why they happened. And I think some people underestimate our youth, that they can handle these things and they need to know the truth. We can't just cover up this truth. For example, the things that happened in Guatemala, that is U.S. history, but isn't taught, as far as I know. And a lot of adults that I know don't understand, don't know about these past events that are part of U.S. history, but it makes the U.S. look bad. And so they feel like people need to be protected from these facts.
Right. It seems strange that we're trying to protect our kids from facts when we're teaching them. But I love that you brought I forgot to mention that you are a fourth grade teacher. So it's kind of neat because you have the kind of both sides of the spectrum as far as younger kids, and you have an older son and you're writing for young adults, that you have that perspective as well. Have you had any issues, as far as you say you talk about these issues with your fourth graders? Have you had any problems with people complaining or anything in your district? I know you said you were in Texas, right?
Right. I haven't had any problems. I mean, I teach, from the social studies book, the facts that are in the social studies books. And in fourth grade, we learn about Texas history. And so, right there in our book, it tells us some of the reasons that the Texans wanted to fight in the Texas Revolution is because they wanted to protect the right to own enslaved people, to have slavery as part of, and Mexico didn't want slavery to be allowed in Texas. And so that was one of the reasons that was fought. The Texas Revolution fought because of this reason. But that's right in our book because it is part of our history. So it isn't like I'm bringing in things that aren't part of the curriculum. It is part of the curriculum. And, the kids at first are surprised. They're like, wait, wasn't slavery bad? And Texas wanted to have it? I'm like, well, that was one of the reasons. There were other reasons, but that was one of them. And so you could kind of see them like thinking about it, but they're drawing these conclusions on their own. I'm just giving them facts, and they understand enough to know that it isn't just black and white as far as like, the Texans were, we call them like the heroes of the Texas Revolution, but, that's not just black and white. There's other things for them to consider. So no, I haven't had any problems, thankfully.
That's great. Good. Yeah, right. That is especially, I love how you're giving them the facts and letting them draw their own conclusions from it, which is that's really wonderful. And just to wrap up, because I'm watching the time, I'd love to hear, do you have something else that you're working on now? Do you think, are you going to stay doing YA fiction or?
Yeah, 100%. That's all I really want to write is young adult fiction. I might try to dabble a little like in a picture book, but I don't foresee myself writing any more books for adults. I kind of write the young adult age group is my favorite to write. So I'm working on a young adult novel that I've turned into an editor, and I don't have anything to announce yet, but I am working on it. So hopefully, there'll be announcements sometime forthcoming.
I just have to ask, because I'm always impressed when I talk to authors who also have a full-time job. How do you find time to do this? Especially being a teacher is such a demanding job. When do you find the time to write? Or is it kind of like a nice stress reliever to do something completely different after you come home?
Well, the two books, The Weight of Everything and the other book that I'm working on, both of them I started like 15, 16 years ago. So I did a lot of writing when my kids were little and they would go to bed. I would write from like 8:30 to 10:30 every night for years. And that was when I was a stay-at-home mom, so I didn't have like a job outside the home. And so I felt like I had a little more time that I could focus on writing. And then once I became a working mom and my kids were in school, I did almost no writing for several years. So it's right now, I'm just kind of working on those old manuscripts, bringing them back. I have a little more time now because my kids are much older, but I usually work on Saturdays, spring break, Thanksgiving break. But when my kids were little and I was like full-time teaching, I almost wrote nothing for many, many years. So thankfully I had that reserves from years ago that I'm kind of bringing back out and revising and rewriting.
That must have been fun to pull them out. And I know you talked about when you pulled out that very first novel, you looked at it and you were like, maybe not. But now you're pulling them out and saying, yeah, I can work with this. That must be exciting.
Yeah, it's exciting. That first one, though, that one's never coming out. It's really, it doesn't have anything redeeming to pull out. But it was a good practice.
Right.
But yeah, it's been fun to kind of bring these books out and just kind of reimagining them. And I mean, there's a lot of rewriting that's going into them.
I'm sure. But that's a nice note for anybody who's watching on the book launch, because it did just come out really recently. Again, that's The Weight of Everything. And so you can go and check that out. I really recommend it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.